Casey 3, our target 3A, is add, subtract, and multiply complex numbers. Okay. A lot of things in this unit will look very similar to things we did in Casey 2, and so therefore things should be a little bit easier for you guys. Okay. So our first mastery learning objective is I can identify the real and imaginary part of complex numbers by rewriting radicals as complex numbers. So, looking at this, right, we have this thing called imaginary numbers. Sorry. And our imaginary number is represented by the square root of -1. Okay? We cannot take the square root of negatives, and that's why we call it imaginary. It doesn't actually exist, but it helps us do a few things. Okay? So the same thing here. If I type in the square root of -1, it will give me this. It says non-real, right? It's imaginary. It's not real. Okay, so anytime you type in a square root of a negative, that's what it will tell you. So we can't use our calculator for these whole problems, but we can use our calculator to help us out. That means I squared, I'll kind of do the work down here, I squared equals the square root of -1 squared. Our square root and our squared cancel out, just like we've seen before. And so we get -1 there. Okay, square rooting something and squaring something are opposites, right? So I squared is the same as -1. Complex number, right, so imaginary numbers is your I. Complex numbers are made up of a real number and an imaginary number. They're made up of two things, and therefore they're complex. So, the real part is A, and the imaginary part is the BI. So we have our real number, that'd be like the number 5. I know what the number 5 is. I know what it looks like. I can count to it, right? And then our imaginary part is BI. I don't know what BI is, or like 3I is. Can't count to it, so it's imaginary. Alright, so let's look at some examples of simplifying some radicals. So number 1, the square root of 36. One thing we want to look at when we're simplifying radicals now is that they have a positive and a negative, okay? So, you need this symbol, which means it is positive or negative every time you do square root, right, or a radical. Right. So, for example, the square root of 36. I can type that in my calculator. And I get 6. And then I need to put that plus, it's called positive, negative, plus or minus 6. And really what that means is I have two answers. My answers are positive 6 and minus 6. Okay? But instead of writing that twice, we just write the plus minus 6. Now, looking at number 2, if I try to take the square root of -36, it's just going to tell me it's not real. Okay? So I take out the real part. I can take the square root of 36. It's this negative part, so we say -1, that we can't do. So the square root of 36 is positive or -6. The square root of -1, as we did up here, right, that is your I. So the I goes right next to the 6. Okay? You'll notice I put these little tails on the I's. That's just to keep it from looking like a 1 or an L or all these other weird things. So a lot of times, right, we put tails on T's to keep them from looking like plus signs. Same thing for an I. They have just a little tail going off to the side. Number 3, square root of 25. There's no negative sign out in front. Okay? That That means I can type that in my calculator. And I get 5. So again, we need our plus or minus 5. Done. Easy. Square root of negative 25. There is a negative under here. That means I have to do the square root of 25 times the square root of negative 1. As we saw here, the square root of 25 is plus or minus 5, and the square root of negative 1 is I. Number 5. No negative. I'm going to type it in my calculator. And I get 10. So, easy enough, right? Plus or minus 10. Number 6, same thing we've seen already, right? We have a negative, so we have to split it up. So we have 100 times the square root of negative 1. Well, the square root of 100 is plus or minus 10. The square root of negative 1 is I. Fabulous. Looking at number 7, same type of thing. I have the square root of negative 81. So the square, same thing here, right? I have the square root of 81 times the square root of negative 1. Square root of 81 is 9. And we get a 9. Number 8 is different. This one has the negative sign inside. This one has the negative sign outside. The negative sign outside doesn't affect what I can do inside. I can still take the square root of 81. Okay. What that minus sign does is tell me I don't want the positive version. I only want the negative version. Okay, so the negative square root of 81 is specifically asking you for whatever the negative version of your square root is. Same thing with number 9. I have that negative sign outside, but now I also have that negative inside. So now I have negative square root of 81 times that negative 1. The negative goes outside. The square root of 81 is 9. The square root of negative 1 is I. Okay. This, we won't be tested on too much, but it's good to know that if there's a negative out in front, it's not asking for, it wants just the negative instead of the plus or minus. Okay, so that's really the only difference between these two answers. Let's look at number 10. Number 10 does have that negative sign inside. So we're going to start by breaking it up. And then I need to find a perfect square that divides, right? 72 is not a perfect square. So I need to find a perfect square that divides into 72. If you divide by all your numbers, you'll find out that 36 times 2 is 72. We still need our times negative 1. Okay. Now the square root of, right, so we have a plus or minus now that we're taking the square roots. The square root of 36 is 6. I cannot take the square root of 2. The square root of negative 1 is I. So we have positive or negative 6 square root 2 I. Be very careful that I is not under the square radical, right? The radical should end here. The I comes after it. Looking at number 11, there is no square root, or there is no negative here. So 45 is not a perfect square. I try and take the square root. So I need to divide 45 by a perfect square. The perfect square that divides into 45 is 9. I need my plus or minus sign out front. The square root of 9 is 3 square root 5. Done. Here I do have my minus sign inside. I cannot take the square root of 24. I get that decimal. So again, I want to look for a number that divides into 24. The number I know that divides into 24 is 4. 4 times 6. Putting my plus or minus 2, square root 6. I goes all the way at the end. Alright, and that is it. Go ahead and get started on 3A.1.